What if I told you that the most decorated rescue pilot in military history started as a janitor who everyone dismissed as worthless? What if the woman who would go on to save 20 lives in a single mission was once humiliated so badly that she almost quit before her training even began? This is the story of Elena Vasquez, a woman who proved that courage doesn't come from privilege. It comes from the refusal to give up when everyone else has written you off. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Vasquez pushed her cleaning cart down the polished hallways of Blackwater Military Aviation Academy at 4:30 in the morning, just as she had done every day for the past 2 years. The wheels squeaked against the marble floor, creating the only sound in the otherwise silent corridors. At 28, she had perfected the art of being invisible. Security guards nodded absently as she passed. Instructors walked by without acknowledging her presence. To them, she was just another member of the maintenance staff, someone whose existence was necessary but unremarkable. What none of them knew was that Elena had spent every night of those 2 years studying. While she mopped floors and emptied trash bins, she absorbed every conversation about flight mechanics, every discussion of tactical maneuvers, every heated debate about helicopter combat strategies. Her small studio apartment above the base laundromat was filled with flight manuals she had purchased with her meager wages, aviation magazines she collected from waiting rooms, and notebooks filled with her own observations about helicopter performance and safety protocols. Elena's fascination with aviation had begun in childhood, growing up in the shadow of Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Her father, Miguel Vasquez, had worked as a ground crew mechanic for 15 years before. A back injury forced him into early retirement. He had taught Elena to recognize different aircraft by their engine sounds, to understand the complex systems that kept helicopters in the air, and to respect the skill required to pilot them safely. When Miguel died in a construction accident during Elena's senior year of high school, she had promised his grave that she would somehow find her way into the sky he had loved so much. But promises made to the dead don't pay for college tuition or flight training. Elena had spent 8 years working various jobs, saving every penny she could toward her aviation dreams. When she learned that Blackwater Academy offered a work-study program that allowed employees to audit classes during their off hours, she had jumped at the opportunity. The pay was minimal and the work was exhausting, but it put her in the right place to learn. During her cleaning rounds, Elena had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the Academy's operations. She knew which instructors were harsh but fair, which ones played favorites, and which ones seemed to genuinely care about developing pilot skills. She had watched hundreds of training exercises from maintenance closets and supply rooms, noting common mistakes and effective techniques. She had even identified patterns in helicopter maintenance issues that the official mechanics had missed, though she had never reported them, knowing that a janitor's observations would be dismissed or ignored. The academy itself was an imposing fortress of glass and steel, built into the Colorado mountainside with commanding views of the training ranges below. It was home to the military's most elite helicopter combat program, producing pilots who would go on to serve in the most dangerous missions around the world. The competition for admission was fierce, with thousands of qualified candidates competing for just 50 spots each year. Most successful applicants came from military families, had expensive private educations, or possessed connections that opened doors others couldn't even see. Elena possessed none of these advantages. Her high school transcript showed decent grades but nothing exceptional. She had no military background, no family connections, and no formal flight training. What she did have was an obsessive dedication to understanding every aspect of helicopter operations and an intuitive grasp of flight dynamics that she had developed through years of observation and self-study. The opportunity that changed everything came disguised as a maintenance request. Elena was cleaning the administration offices when she overheard Director Colonel Patricia Hawthorne discussing the Academy's new diversity initiative with her assistant. The program was designed to identify exceptional candidates from non-traditional backgrounds, offering them a chance to compete for admission based solely on aptitude tests and practical assessments rather than conventional qualifications. Elena's hands trembled as she continued dusting the bookshelf, straining to catch every word of the conversation. The application deadline was in 3 days. The assessment would include written examinations on flight theory, mechanical systems, and tactical operations, followed by simulator tests that would evaluate spatial reasoning, reaction time, and decision-making under pressure. No prior flight experience was required, but the standards would be the same as for all other applicants. That night, Elena sat in her apartment with the application forms spread across her small kitchen table. The questions were intimidating, asking for essays on leadership experience, descriptions of challenges overcome, and explanations of why she wanted to become a military pilot. How could she explain that flying represented not just a career goal, but a deep spiritual connection to her father's memory? How could she convey that her years of invisible observation had given her insights into aviation that others might not possess? She wrote about her father, about the nights they had spent watching helicopters return from training missions, about the way his eyes had lit up when he explained the physics of rotor dynamics. She wrote about her work at the academy, about the patterns she had observed, about her certainty that she belonged in the cockpit, despite having never sat in one. She wrote with the passion of someone who had dreamed the same dream for 10 years without wavering. The written examination took place on a Saturday morning in a lecture hall Elena had cleaned 1,000 times. She arrived early, dressed in her only business outfit, a navy blue suit she had purchased at a thrift store and carefully tailored to fit properly. The other applicants looked exactly as she had expected, young, confident, wearing expensive clothes and discussing their college achievements and family military histories. Elena took a seat in the back corner and focused on the test booklet. The questions covered aerodynamics, weather patterns, navigation systems, emergency procedures, and tactical considerations. Elena answered each one methodically, drawing on the knowledge she had accumulated through years of studying and observation. When asked about helicopter auto-rotation procedures, she provided not just the textbook answer, but additional insights about altitude and wind considerations that she had learned by watching training exercises. When asked about formation flying tactics, she included details about communication protocols and visual reference points that most applicants would never have encountered. The simulator assessment was held the following week in the Academy's state-of-the-art training facility. Elena had watched countless students struggle through these same exercises from her position cleaning the observation deck, but she had never imagined she would be strapped into one of the pilot seats herself. The simulator was incredibly realistic, with full motion capability and high-resolution visual systems that made the virtual environment feel completely authentic. Elena's first test scenario involved a routine patrol flight that gradually introduced various complications. She handled the basic flight controls intuitively, as if her hands remembered movements they had never actually performed. When the scenario introduced engine failure at low altitude, she immediately initiated auto-rotation procedures, managing the collective and cyclic controls to maintain optimal glide slope. When enemy fire began targeting her position, she executed evasive maneuvers while maintaining mission objectives and protecting simulated ground forces. The final scenario was a complex rescue mission that required precise flying in mountainous terrain while under enemy fire. Elena navigated through narrow valleys, avoided surface-to-air missile threats, and successfully extracted wounded personnel from a hostile landing zone. Throughout the exercise, her performance remained calm, efficient, and tactically sound. She completed the mission with minimal damage to her aircraft and 0 casualties among the personnel she was tasked to rescue. When Elena emerged from the simulator, she found 3 instructors reviewing her performance data with expressions of surprised interest. Her flight path efficiency, reaction times, and decision-making scores were among the highest they had recorded. More importantly, her tactical awareness and ability to adapt to changing conditions suggested a natural aptitude for combat flying that couldn't be taught. The acceptance letter arrived 2 weeks later in a plain white envelope that Elena almost threw away, assuming it was junk mail. When she finally opened it and read the single paragraph informing her that she had been selected for the next class at Blackwater Military Aviation Academy, she sat on her apartment floor and cried for 20 minutes. Her father had always told her that persistence could overcome any obstacle, and she felt his presence strongly in that moment. Elena's first day at the academy as a student, rather than an employee, felt surreal. She walked through the same corridors she had cleaned for 2 years, but now she carried textbooks instead of cleaning supplies. The other new cadets were gathering in the main briefing room, and Elena recognized many of them from the assessment sessions. They looked just as young and confident as she had expected, chatting easily about their backgrounds and expectations. She chose a seat near the middle of the room, hoping to blend in without drawing attention to her differences. The conversations around her revolved around college experiences, family military traditions, and expensive flight training programs. Elena listened quietly, acutely aware that she had none of these shared reference points. When other cadets asked about her background, she mentioned her work at the academy, but didn't elaborate on the nature of her employment. The briefing began promptly at 8 o'clock with the entrance of Commandant Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Steele. Steele was a legend in military aviation, with 25 years of combat experience and a reputation for producing the finest helicopter pilots in the world. He was also notorious for his demanding standards and his belief that only exceptional individuals deserved to fly military aircraft. As he surveyed the room full of new cadets, his expression suggested that he doubted many of them would successfully complete the program. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steele began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been questioned. "You have been selected from thousands of applicants to participate in the most challenging helicopter combat training program in the world. Over the next 18 months, you will be pushed beyond your limits physically, mentally, and emotionally. Most of you will not graduate. Those who do will join an elite fraternity of warriors who have proven themselves worthy of flying the most advanced combat aircraft ever built." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Steele's gaze moved systematically across the room, pausing briefly on each cadet as if making individual assessments. When his eyes met Elena's, something cold flickered across his expression. She had seen that look before, though never directed at her personally. It was the look of someone who had already decided that she didn't belong. "Excellence in this program is not negotiable," Steele continued. "We don't lower standards to accommodate anyone's limitations or background. You will succeed based on merit alone, or you will fail and be removed. There are no participation trophies in combat aviation. There are only pilots who bring their people home safely and pilots who don't." The underlying message was clear to Elena. Despite the Academy's diversity initiative, she would receive no special consideration or allowances. She would be held to the same standards as everyone else, but without the advantages that her fellow cadets possessed. The playing field was level in theory, but not in reality. After the briefing, the cadets were divided into smaller groups for initial assessments and equipment fitting. Elena found herself assigned to Group Charlie, led by Captain Jennifer Morrison, a former combat pilot who now served as a primary instructor. Morrison had a reputation for being fair but demanding, and Elena hoped that she might judge cadets based on performance rather than preconceptions. The first practical exercise involved basic aircraft familiarization using the Academy's training helicopters, modified UH-60 Black Hawks equipped with dual controls and comprehensive instrumentation, for instructional purposes. Elena approached her assigned aircraft with the same careful attention she had observed in successful cadets over the years. She conducted the pre-flight inspection methodically, checking every system and component according to the procedures she had memorized from countless hours of studying maintenance manuals. Captain Morrison watched Elena's inspection with interest, noting the thoroughness and confidence with which she performed each check. When Elena identified a minor hydraulic fluid leak that the previous inspection had missed, Morrison made a note in her evaluation folder. Most new cadets would have overlooked such a subtle issue, but Elena's years of observing maintenance procedures had taught her to recognize even small anomalies. The cockpit familiarization went equally well. Elena located and identified every switch, gauge, and control system without hesitation. She demonstrated understanding of the helicopter's various modes of operation and could explain the function of backup systems and emergency procedures. Her performance was not just competent, but displayed a depth of knowledge that surprised her instructor. "Where did you learn so much about helicopter systems?" Morrison asked as they completed the exercise. "I've been studying aviation for years," Elena replied carefully. She didn't want to reveal the full extent of her background observations, knowing that it might be seen as inappropriate or even unethical. "It's always been my dream to fly." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Well, you certainly have the technical foundation. Let's see how you handle the controls." The actual flight training began the following week with basic hover exercises in a controlled environment. Elena's group was taken to a large concrete pad surrounded by safety barriers, where each cadet would attempt to maintain a stable hover while learning to coordinate the helicopter's complex control inputs. The exercise looked simple, but required precise coordination between the collective lever, which controlled vertical movement, the cyclic stick, which controlled forward, backward, and lateral movement, and the anti-torque pedals, which controlled the aircraft's rotation around its vertical axis. Elena had watched hundreds of students struggle through this same exercise during her cleaning duties, and she understood that the key was smooth, minimal inputs rather than large corrections that would cause the aircraft to oscillate wildly. When her turn came, she settled into the pilot's seat with the same calm focus she had demonstrated in the simulator. The instructor pilot in the right seat would maintain overall safety control, but Elena would perform the actual flying. As the helicopter lifted off the ground, Elena felt a profound sense of completion, as if a missing piece of herself had suddenly fallen into place. The aircraft responded to her inputs with surprising precision, maintaining a stable hover just 3 feet above the ground. She made small adjustments to compensate for wind gusts and rotor wash effects, keeping the helicopter centered over a designated spot on the pad. "Outstanding," the instructor pilot commented through the intercom. "Most students take several flights to achieve that level of control. Have you flown before?" "No, sir," Elena replied, concentrating on maintaining her hover. "This is my first time in a helicopter." "Well, you're a natural. Let's try some basic movements." For the next 30 minutes, Elena practiced moving the helicopter forward, backward, and sideways while maintaining altitude and heading. Each maneuver felt intuitive, as if she was rediscovering abilities rather than learning new skills. By the end of the flight, she was performing complex patterns that typically required weeks of practice to master. Word of Elena's exceptional performance spread quickly through the instructor's staff. Captain Morrison reported to Commandant Steele that they might have discovered a prodigy, someone with the rare combination of technical knowledge, spatial awareness, and natural flying ability that characterized truly exceptional pilots. Elena's scores in ground school were also outstanding. demonstrating mastery of complex subjects like navigation, weather theory, and tactical communications. But Elena's rapid progress also attracted unwanted attention from some of her fellow cadets, a group led by Cadet Thomas Ashford, whose father was a retired general and whose family had produced military pilots for 4 generations, began to question how someone with Elena's background could be outperforming students with far more prestigious credentials. "There's something not right about her," Ashford confided to his closest friends during an evening study session. "Nobody learns to fly that fast without previous experience. She's either lying about her background or getting help that the rest of us aren't." The whispers and suspicious glances began subtly, but Elena noticed them immediately. She had spent years observing social dynamics from the periphery, and she recognized the signs of group suspicion and exclusion. Some cadets stopped including her in study groups. Others would end conversations abruptly when she approached. A few began making pointed comments about diversity quotas and lowered standards, though never directly to her face. Elena's response was to work even harder and perform even better. If her classmates wanted to question her qualifications, she would prove them wrong through undeniable excellence. She spent extra hours in the simulator, volunteered for additional ground training sessions, and maintained perfect scores on every examination and practical exercise. Her flight performance continued to improve at a rate that impressed even veteran instructors. The situation reached a turning point during the program's first major evaluation, a comprehensive assessment that would determine which cadets would continue to advance training and which would be eliminated from the program. The evaluation included written examinations, simulator assessments, and actual flight tests in increasingly challenging scenarios. Elena approached the evaluation with confidence, knowing that her preparation had been thorough and her performance consistent. The written examination covered all aspects of helicopter operations, from basic aerodynamics to complex tactical scenarios. Elena completed the test efficiently, drawing on her extensive theoretical knowledge and practical observations. The simulator assessment involved emergency procedures, including engine failures, severe weather, and combat scenarios. Elena handled each challenge methodically, demonstrating the calm decision-making that characterizes successful combat pilots. The flight evaluation was the most demanding part of the assessment. Each cadet had to demonstrate proficiency in basic flying skills, emergency procedures, and tactical maneuvers while being evaluated by a panel of senior instructors. Elena's test flight included autorotation landings, formation flying, and a complex navigation exercise that required precise timing and route planning. When the results were announced, Elena had achieved the highest overall score in her class, outperforming cadets with far more resources and theoretical advantages. Her flight skills were rated as exceptional, her technical knowledge as outstanding, and her decision-making under pressure as superior. She had not just met the program's demanding standards, but had exceeded them significantly. Commandant Steele reviewed Elena's evaluation results with growing concern. Her performance was undeniably excellent, but her rapid progress and exceptional abilities seemed inconsistent with her stated background. Someone with no previous flight training shouldn't be outperforming experienced cadets so dramatically. Either Elena was hiding something about her past, or she possessed natural abilities that were almost unprecedented. Steele decided to conduct his own investigation into Elena's background. He contacted her previous employers, reviewed her military records, which were minimal since she had never served, and spoke with instructors who had observed her training. What he discovered surprised him. Elena's work history showed a pattern of exceptional performance in every position she had held, but nothing that would explain her aviation aptitude. Her academic records were solid, but not extraordinary. There was no evidence of hidden flight training or undisclosed military experience. What Steele did find was that Elena had worked at the academy for 2 years as a maintenance worker, giving her extensive exposure to flight operations and training procedures. While this wasn't necessarily inappropriate, it did provide an explanation for her familiarity with Academy protocols and her deep understanding of helicopter systems. Steele began to wonder if Elena had gained an unfair advantage through her employment, observing training that other cadets had to learn from scratch. The more Steele investigated, the more convinced he became that Elena represented a problem that needed to be addressed. The Academy's reputation was built on producing the finest pilots through the most demanding training. If word spread that a former janitor could outperform cadets from elite backgrounds, it would undermine the program's prestige and call into question the value of traditional qualifications. Steele's concerns were reinforced during a conversation with several prominent alumni and donors who were visiting the Academy for an annual review. When they learned about Elena's background and performance, their reaction was skeptical and concerned. They questioned whether the Academy was maintaining its standards or compromising excellence for the sake of diversity. Their implied threat to reduce support for the program unless traditional values were maintained was unmistakable. Elena remained unaware of these behind-the-scenes discussions, focusing instead on her training and her determination to prove herself worthy of the opportunity she had been given. She continued to excel in every aspect of the program, but she also noticed that her treatment by some instructors was beginning to change. Questions about her performance became more pointed. Evaluations that should have been straightforward became lengthy interrogations. Equipment assignments seemed to favor other cadets. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years observing institutional dynamics from the outside. Elena realized that her success was becoming a liability rather than an asset, that her exceptional performance was being viewed with suspicion rather than celebrated as achievement. She began to understand that proving her competence might not be enough to secure her place in the program. But Elena had not come this far to surrender to institutional prejudice or political pressure. She had promised her father that she would find her way into the sky, and she intended to keep that promise regardless of the obstacles placed in her path. If her excellence was being questioned, she would respond with even greater excellence. If her background was being used against her, she would prove that competence came from dedication rather than privilege. Elena's determination would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined, as the Academy's leadership decided that her continued presence represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force Elena to fight not just for her dreams, but for her dignity and her future. In the mountains of Colorado, a young woman who had started as an invisible janitor was about to discover just how far some people would go to maintain their version of the natural order. The real test of Elena's resolve was about to begin, and it would determine not just her own future, but the futures of countless others who dreamed of earning their place in the sky through merit rather than birthright. The battle lines were drawn, and Elena Vasquez stood alone on one side, facing an institution determined to prove that some people, no matter how capable, simply didn't belong. The systematic dismantling of Elena's position at Blackwater began with small, seemingly innocent changes that only someone with her background would notice. Equipment assignments that had been random suddenly followed patterns that consistently disadvantaged her. Training schedules were modified at the last minute in ways that isolated her from study groups and informal mentorship opportunities. Most telling of all, her maintenance requests for simulator issues were processed more slowly than those of other cadets, forcing her to train on equipment with known defects while others received priority repairs. Elena's first real indication that her situation had fundamentally changed came during a routine flight evaluation in her 8th week of training. She had been assigned to Aircraft 847, a helicopter she knew from her maintenance days had persistent issues with its hydraulic pressure sensors. The problem was subtle but significant. causing false readings that could lead pilots to make incorrect control inputs during precision maneuvers. Elena had observed 3 different cadets struggle with the same aircraft over the past month, each receiving lower scores despite technically competent flying. When Elena requested a different aircraft for her evaluation, citing the known maintenance issue, Captain Morrison's response was unexpectedly dismissive. The aircraft had been inspected and certified as airworthy, Morrison explained, and suggesting, otherwise implied that Elena didn't trust the Academy's maintenance standards. The implication was clear. Elena's background as a former maintenance worker was being used to question her credibility rather than validate her technical knowledge. Elena flew the evaluation in aircraft 847, compensating mentally for the hydraulic sensor errors while maintaining the precise control inputs required for the test. Her performance was technically flawless, but the faulty readings created the appearance of inconsistent aircraft control to observers who didn't understand the underlying mechanical issue. When her scores were posted, they reflected adequate performance rather than the excellence she had consistently demonstrated in properly functioning aircraft. Commandant Steele used Elena's lower evaluation score as justification for placing her on academic probation, a status that required additional monitoring and created a formal record of performance concerns. Elena knew that the probation was pretextual, designed to create paper documentation that could support her eventual dismissal from the program. She also understood that challenging the decision directly would be seen as insubordination and could provide additional grounds for removal. Instead, Elena focused on documenting every aspect of her training experience, keeping detailed records of equipment assignments, maintenance issues, and instructor interactions. If her competence was going to be questioned based on manipulated circumstances, she wanted evidence of the manipulation. She also began studying even harder, determined to make her performance so outstanding that it couldn't be dismissed or minimized regardless of artificial obstacles. The social isolation Elena had experienced from some cadets intensified as word of her probationary status spread through the program. Cadet Ashford, whose initial suspicions about Elena had evolved into active hostility, began openly questioning whether diversity initiatives were compromising the Academy's standards. His comments were carefully crafted to avoid direct accusations while creating doubt about Elena's qualifications and place in the program. During a tactics seminar discussing close air support operations, Ashford raised his hand to ask whether pilots from non-traditional backgrounds might lack the cultural understanding necessary for effective military operations. The question was ostensibly academic, but every person in the room understood its target. Elena felt dozens of eyes turning toward her, measuring her reaction and waiting to see if she would respond to the provocation. Elena maintained her composure and continued taking notes, but she felt the familiar weight of being the only person in the room whose competence was constantly questioned. Her fellow cadets had the luxury of being judged as individuals, while she represented an entire category that others seemed determined to prove didn't belong. The psychological pressure of carrying that burden while trying to excel in an already demanding program was exhausting. The harassment escalated beyond subtle discrimination when Elena began receiving anonymous notes criticizing her presence in the program. The messages were slipped under her door, tucked into her textbooks, and left in her assigned locker. They contained detailed analyses of her performance, pointing out minor mistakes and suggesting that her continued enrollment was preventing more qualified candidates from receiving training opportunities. The notes were unsigned but clearly came from someone with access to her academic records and evaluation reports. Elena reported the harassment to Captain Morrison, who promised to investigate, but seemed skeptical about the seriousness of the situation. Morrison suggested that Elena might be misinterpreting normal competitive pressure as personal targeting, and recommended that she focus on her academic performance rather than social dynamics. The implied message was that Elena was expected to tolerate treatment that would be considered unacceptable if directed at other cadets. When Morrison's investigation predictably found no evidence of wrongdoing, Elena realized that she was entirely on her own. The Academy's leadership had decided that she was a problem to be managed rather than a student to be developed, and any complaints about unfair treatment would be dismissed as excuses for substandard performance. Her only option was to succeed, so dramatically that her critics would be forced to acknowledge her competence. Elena's opportunity to demonstrate her exceptional abilities came during the program's midterm practical examination, a comprehensive assessment that required cadets to plan and execute a complex mission involving navigation, tactical maneuvering, and precision flying. Each cadet was given identical mission parameters and evaluated on their planning process, execution efficiency, and ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The examination was designed to identify future leaders and eliminate candidates who couldn't handle the demands of combat operations. Elena approached the mission planning with the same methodical precision she had learned during her maintenance work. She analyzed weather patterns, terrain features, and potential threat scenarios to develop multiple contingency plans for every phase of the operation. Her route planning incorporated backup navigation waypoints and alternative approach vectors that would allow mission completion even if primary plans were compromised. She identified potential mechanical issues that could affect aircraft performance and developed workarounds that would maintain mission effectiveness. The actual flight examination took place over the Academy's mountain training range, a challenging environment that replicated the conditions pilots would face in real-world combat operations. Elena's mission required her to navigate through narrow valleys, maintain precise altitude control in turbulent air, and execute tactical approaches to simulated landing zones while avoiding hypothetical enemy threats. The entire flight was monitored by instructors in chase aircraft and ground-based observation posts. Elena's execution was flawless from takeoff to landing. She navigated through the mountain terrain with precision, maintaining perfect timing, despite wind conditions that forced other cadets to deviate from their planned routes. Her tactical approaches demonstrated sophisticated understanding of threat assessment and risk mitigation. Most impressively, when her assigned route was blocked by simulated enemy activity, she implemented one of her contingency plans seamlessly, completing the mission objectives without compromising safety or efficiency. When the examination results were compiled, Elena had achieved the highest score in program history, outperforming not just her current classmates, but every cadet who had taken the examination in the past 5 years. Her planning process was rated as exceptional, her execution as outstanding, and her adaptability under pressure as superior. The evaluation panel noted that her performance demonstrated leadership potential and recommended her for accelerated advancement to advanced training phases. Commandant Steele's reaction to Elena's extraordinary performance was not celebration but increased concern. A cadet on academic probation shouldn't be capable of record-breaking achievement, and Elena's success called into question the validity of her earlier poor evaluation. Either the probation had been unjustified, which would reflect poorly on the Academy's evaluation procedures, or Elena was somehow cheating or receiving unauthorized assistance. Steele ordered a comprehensive investigation into Elena's preparation for the examination, including analysis of her study materials, review of her access to Academy facilities, and interviews with anyone who might have provided her with information or assistance. The investigation was ostensibly focused on ensuring fair testing procedures, but Elena understood that its real purpose was to find grounds for invalidating her outstanding performance. The investigation found no evidence of cheating or unauthorized assistance, but it did reveal the extent of Elena's self-directed learning and preparation. Her apartment was filled with technical manuals, navigation charts, and tactical studies that she had purchased with her own money. Her study notes demonstrated mastery of subjects that weren't formally covered until later in the program. Her preparation had been more thorough and comprehensive than that of cadets with far greater resources and support. Rather than validating Elena's achievement, the investigation's findings only increased suspicions about her background and motivations. How had a former maintenance worker acquired such extensive technical knowledge? Where had she learned advanced tactical concepts that weren't taught to beginning students? Her exceptional preparation was reframed as evidence that she had gained unfair advantages through her previous employment at the academy. Steele used the investigation results to justify placing additional restrictions on Elena's access to academy facilities and resources. She was prohibited from using the library during evening hours, when other cadets typically formed study groups and received informal mentoring from instructors. Her simulator access was limited to scheduled training sessions, preventing the additional practice time that had contributed to her rapid skill development. Most significantly, she was assigned to remedial instruction groups despite her outstanding performance, a move that effectively labeled her as a struggling student who required additional support. The remedial designation had devastating effects on Elena's standing within the cadet corps. Other students began treating her as someone who was failing the program rather than excelling in it. Study group invitations disappeared entirely. Social interactions became awkward as classmates tried to balance politeness with their perception that Elena was academically deficient. The isolation that had been uncomfortable became complete, leaving Elena without peer support or informal learning opportunities. Elena's response to these setbacks was to focus even more intensely on her individual preparation and performance. If she couldn't rely on social support or institutional fairness, she would succeed through sheer competence and determination. She studied until exhaustion every night, using her limited simulator time with maximum efficiency, and approached every evaluation with the understanding that she had to perform at a higher level than other cadets to receive equivalent recognition. The psychological toll of constant scrutiny and systematic disadvantagement was severe, but Elena drew strength from her father's memory and her promise to honor his legacy. Every obstacle placed in her path was another challenge to overcome, another opportunity to prove that excellence could triumph over prejudice. She refused to give her critics the satisfaction of seeing her quit or fail, knowing that her success would open doors for future students who faced similar challenges. Elena's determination was tested most severely during the program's combat simulation exercises, complex scenarios that required cadets to work in teams while facing simulated enemy threats. These exercises were designed to evaluate not just individual flying skills, but also communication, leadership, and ability to function under extreme stress. Success required trust and cooperation between team members, qualities that were difficult to maintain when one team member was viewed with suspicion by her peers. Elena was consistently assigned to teams with the weakest performers, cadets who were struggling with basic flight skills and needed additional support to complete mission objectives. While other high-performing students were grouped together to demonstrate advanced tactics and leadership potential, Elena found herself in the role of carrying less capable teammates through exercises that should have showcased her own abilities. The team assignments were presented as random, but Elena recognized the pattern that consistently prevented her from demonstrating her full potential. During one particularly challenging combat simulation, Elena's team was tasked with conducting a rescue operation in hostile territory while under enemy fire. The mission required precise coordination between multiple aircraft, with each pilot responsible for specific aspects of the overall operation. Elena was assigned the most dangerous role, serving as the primary rescue aircraft that would extract simulated casualties from a contested landing zone while other team members provided cover and suppression of enemy positions. The exercise began badly when Elena's assigned wingman, Cadet Peterson, became disoriented during the approach phase and broke formation at a critical moment. Peterson's error exposed Elena's aircraft to simulated enemy fire and compromised the mission timeline, forcing Elena to adapt her approach while maintaining protection for the ground forces she was tasked to extract. Despite these complications, Elena successfully completed the rescue operation, extracting all simulated casualties while minimizing exposure to enemy threats. The after-action review focused not on Elena's successful adaptation to teammate errors, but on the team's overall communication failures and tactical mistakes. Peterson's navigation error was attributed to unclear instructions from Elena as team leader, despite recordings that showed her communications had been clear and professional. Elena's improvised tactics, which had salvaged the mission despite teammate failures, were criticized as deviation from standard procedures, rather than praised as effective problem-solving. The pattern of holding Elena to different standards than her peers became impossible to ignore when the same instructor, who criticized her tactical improvisation, praised an identical adaptation performed by Cadet Ashford during a subsequent exercise. Ashford's ability to overcome teammate mistakes was described as exceptional leadership and tactical flexibility, qualities that made him an ideal candidate for advanced training and future command positions. Elena's identical performance had been characterized as concerning deviation from established procedures. Elena began to understand that her situation was not just about individual prejudice or institutional inertia, but about a systematic effort to force her out of the program. Regardless of her performance, her excellence was being reinterpreted as problematic, her adaptability as nonconformity, and her dedication as evidence of some hidden agenda. No level of achievement would be sufficient to secure her place, because the decision had already been made that she didn't belong. The breaking point came during Elena's final advanced flight evaluation, a comprehensive assessment that would determine whether she qualified for the program's most challenging phase: combat tactics and weapons training. Elena had prepared for months, knowing that this evaluation represented her last opportunity to prove definitively that she deserved to continue in the program. Her preparation had been exhaustive, covering every possible scenario and contingency that might arise during the evaluation. Elena was assigned Aircraft 823 for her evaluation, a helicopter she immediately recognized as having significant maintenance issues that hadn't been addressed despite repeated reports from previous pilots. The aircraft's engine monitoring system provided false readings that could mask developing problems, and its flight control responses were inconsistent due to worn hydraulic components. Elena had observed several cadets struggle with the same aircraft, receiving lower scores due to equipment problems rather than pilot performance. Elena's request to use a different aircraft for her critical evaluation was denied with the explanation that all available helicopters were airworthy and equivalent for testing purposes. She was told that suggesting otherwise demonstrated lack of confidence in her abilities and unwillingness to adapt to challenging conditions, qualities that would make her unsuitable for combat operations where equipment problems were common. The message was clear: fly the defective aircraft or be removed from the program for refusing to complete the evaluation. Elena flew Aircraft 823 with the skill and adaptability she had developed over months of training, compensating for every mechanical deficiency while maintaining the precision required for the evaluation. Her performance was technically outstanding, demonstrating mastery of advanced flight maneuvers despite equipment that made such precision extremely difficult. She completed every required task efficiently and safely, showing the kind of adaptability that would be invaluable in real-world operations. When Elena's evaluation scores were posted, they reflected barely acceptable performance rather than the excellence she had demonstrated. The evaluating instructors noted concerns about aircraft handling, precision control, and adaptability to changing conditions, all areas where Elena had actually excelled despite equipment limitations. Her performance was characterized as meeting minimum standards rather than exceeding expectations, an assessment that would prevent her advancement to weapons training and effectively end her prospects for combat pilot qualification. Elena requested a formal review of her evaluation, presenting documentation of aircraft 823's known maintenance issues and pointing out the discrepancy between her actual performance and the scores she had received. Her appeal was dismissed with the explanation that making excuses for substandard performance demonstrated poor judgment and inability to accept responsibility for mistakes. She was informed that questioning instructor evaluations showed disrespect for authority and lack of professionalism expected from military officers. The denial of Elena's appeal was accompanied by a formal letter of counseling that criticized her attitude, questioned her commitment to military values, and recommended that she consider whether the aviation program was appropriate for her goals and abilities. The letter would become part of her permanent record and would be considered in any future evaluations or advancement decisions. Elena understood that she was being given an opportunity to withdraw voluntarily before being formally dismissed from the program. Elena's fellow cadets learned of her counseling letter through unofficial channels, and their reactions ranged from awkward sympathy to barely concealed satisfaction. Some genuinely regretted seeing a capable pilot struggling with the program, while others felt vindicated in their belief that Elena had never truly belonged at the academy. The social dynamics that had already isolated Elena became even more pronounced as classmates began treating her as someone whose failure was inevitable. Cadet Ashford's reaction was particularly telling. During a group discussion about the challenges of military aviation training, he made pointed comments about the importance of accepting feedback gracefully and learning from mistakes, rather than making excuses. His remarks were ostensibly general observations about professional development, but everyone present understood them as commentary on Elena's situation. The message was that her struggles were the result of personal failings rather than institutional bias. Elena's instructors began treating her differently as well, with some showing awkward sympathy while others maintained professional distance that felt like disapproval. Captain Morrison, who had once praised Elena's technical knowledge and flying ability, now seemed uncomfortable during their interactions and focused conversations on areas where improvement was needed rather than acknowledging Elena's strengths. The shift in Morrison's attitude was particularly painful because Elena had hoped to find at least one advocate within the instructor corps. Elena realized that her position at the academy had become untenable not because of her performance, but because of decisions made at levels far above her interaction with individual instructors or classmates. She was fighting not just for her own future, but against an institutional determination to prove that people like her couldn't succeed in elite military programs. Her excellence had become a threat to established hierarchies and assumptions about who deserved opportunities for advancement. But Elena refused to surrender to institutional pressure or accept that her dreams were impossible to achieve. She had come too far and overcome too many obstacles to quit when victory was within reach. Her father had taught her that persistence could overcome any challenge, and she intended to honor that lesson regardless of the personal cost. If the academy was determined to force her out, they would have to do it through formal dismissal rather than voluntary withdrawal. Elena's decision to continue fighting for her place in the program set the stage for the final confrontation that would determine not just her future, but the academy's willingness to acknowledge excellence regardless of its source. She understood that her next evaluation would likely be her last opportunity to prove herself, but she also knew that real-world events were about to provide a different kind of test entirely. In the mountains surrounding Blackwater Academy, circumstances were developing that would give Elena the chance to demonstrate that her skills were not just adequate for military aviation, but essential for saving lives. When everything went wrong, the stage was set for Elena to prove that competence could triumph over prejudice, that excellence could overcome institutional resistance, and that courage could emerge from the most unlikely sources. Her greatest test was approaching, and it would determine whether the Academy's leadership was more committed to preserving their assumptions or protecting the lives of the people they were sworn to serve. The emergency call came at 0347 hours on a frigid February morning when most of Blackwater Academy was asleep. Elena had been awake for 2 hours, using the quiet pre-dawn time to review tactical manuals in preparation for what she knew would likely be her final evaluation. The piercing sound of the emergency klaxon shattered the silence, followed immediately by the Academy's public address system crackling to life with urgent announcements. All qualified pilots report to Operations Center immediately. Emergency. Search and rescue operation. This is not a drill. Repeat, all qualified pilots to operations immediately. Elena hesitated for a moment, knowing that as a cadet still under counseling, she wasn't technically included in the qualified pilot's designation. But her training had covered enough emergency procedures to understand that every available helicopter and pilot might be needed regardless of their formal status. She dressed quickly in her flight suit and ran toward the operations center, joining streams of instructors and advanced cadets responding to the emergency call. The operations center was controlled chaos when Elena arrived. Multiple radio communications filled the air with updates from various agencies, while large display screens showed weather patterns, terrain maps, and aircraft positions across the Colorado region. Commandant Steele stood at the center of the activity, coordinating with external agencies, while senior instructors organized available resources and personnel. The situation became clear as Elena listened to the briefings and radio traffic. A civilian passenger bus carrying 23 people had lost control during a late-night mountain crossing and crashed into a deep ravine, approximately 40 miles northeast of the Academy. The accident site was in extremely rugged terrain, accessible only by helicopter, and current weather conditions included heavy snow, high winds, and visibility reduced to near zero in many areas. Initial reports from the Colorado State Patrol helicopter that had located the crash site were grim. The bus had tumbled nearly 300 feet down a steep mountainside before coming to rest against a cluster of pine trees that had prevented it from falling even further into the ravine. The aircraft had confirmed multiple casualties and survivors, but the precarious position of the wreckage meant that any rescue attempt would be extraordinarily dangerous. Elena absorbed every detail of the emergency briefing, while staying inconspicuously at the back of the assembled pilots and instructors. The terrain around the crash site was notorious among mountain pilots for its unpredictable wind patterns, sudden weather changes, and limited landing options. Even experienced combat veterans considered it among the most challenging flying environments in Colorado, particularly under the current weather conditions. The rescue operation would require multiple helicopter teams working in coordination. Medical evacuation aircraft would need to extract the most seriously injured survivors as quickly as possible, while heavy lift helicopters would attempt to stabilize the wreckage and create safe access for rescue personnel. Every aspect of the operation would be complicated by weather, terrain, and the unstable condition of the bus itself. As Steele organized the available pilots into mission teams, Elena noticed that the Academy's roster of qualified mountain rescue pilots was smaller than the scope of the emergency required. Several senior instructors were attending a conference in California, while others were grounded due to minor injuries or medical issues. The remaining qualified pilots would be stretched thin attempting to manage such a complex rescue operation in dangerous conditions. Captain Morrison approached Steele with a roster of available pilots and aircraft, pointing out the limitations they faced in terms of both personnel and equipment. Elena could see Morrison gesturing toward various names on the list, apparently discussing which pilots had the experience and skills necessary for such a dangerous operation. Their conversation was animated but quiet, filled with the kind of professional urgency that characterized life or death planning sessions. Elena made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life and career. She approached Captain Morrison during a brief lull in the planning discussions, knowing that her intervention might be seen as inappropriate but unable to remain passive, while people were dying in the mountains. "Captain Morrison," Elena said quietly, "I'd like to volunteer for the rescue operation. I know I'm not officially qualified, but I've studied mountain flying extensively, and my technical knowledge might be useful." Morrison looked surprised and glanced toward Commandant Steele, who had overheard Elena's offer and was approaching with an expression of displeasure. Elena braced herself for the rejection she expected, knowing that her counseling status made her an unlikely candidate for such a critical mission. "Cadet Vasquez," Steele said coldly, "this is not a training exercise. We need experienced pilots, not students who are struggling to meet basic program standards." "Sir," Elena replied respectfully but firmly, "I understand the risks involved. But I also know that every available pilot might be needed. I'm willing to serve in whatever capacity would be most helpful." Before Steele could respond, one of the radio operators called out with an update that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. The weather at the crash site was deteriorating rapidly, with wind gusts increasing to dangerous levels and visibility dropping to less than 50 feet. The Colorado State Patrol helicopter had been forced to abort its rescue attempts and return to base, leaving the survivors completely isolated until conditions improved. The weather report created a new sense of urgency in the operations center. Every hour of delay meant increased risk for the injured survivors, particularly in sub-zero temperatures with limited shelter. Several of the planned rescue aircraft would be unable to operate safely in the worsening conditions, forcing a complete revision of the mission plan with fewer resources and higher risks. Elena seized the moment created by the changing situation. "Sir, I've analyzed weather patterns in that area extensively during my navigation studies. I know the terrain features that create wind shear and visibility problems, and I understand the tactical approaches that might work even in severe conditions." Morrison looked at Elena with renewed interest, remembering her exceptional performance in mountain navigation exercises and her detailed knowledge of regional weather patterns. She turned to Steele with a suggestion that surprised everyone present. "Commandant, Cadet Vasquez has demonstrated outstanding technical knowledge and flying ability throughout her training. Her scores in mountain navigation and emergency procedures have been consistently excellent. Under these circumstances, we should consider every qualified pilot, regardless of their academic status." Elena felt the attention of the entire operations center focused on her as Steele weighed Morrison's recommendation against his institutional prejudices and personal opinions about Elena's suitability for the program. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, balancing the risk of including a cadet in a dangerous mission against the desperate need for every available pilot. The decision was made for Steele by another urgent radio transmission. The Rescue Coordination Center reported that ground access to the crash site would be impossible due to avalanche risks and road conditions. The entire rescue operation would depend on helicopter access, and they needed every aircraft and pilot that could safely operate in mountain conditions. The survivors were counting on maximum available resources being deployed as quickly as possible. "Fine," Steele said reluctantly, "but Cadet Vasquez will fly with an instructor pilot and serve only as backup support. She is not to take primary control of any aircraft during this operation." Elena nodded her acceptance of the conditions, knowing that any participation in the rescue operation was more than she had dared to hope for. She was assigned to fly with Captain Morrison in one of the Academy's most advanced helicopters, a modified Black Hawk equipped with specialized mountain rescue equipment and enhanced navigation systems. The pre-flight briefing covered every aspect of the dangerous mission they were about to undertake. The crash site was located in a narrow valley surrounded by peaks that rose to over 12,000 feet, creating unpredictable wind patterns and severe turbulence. The approach would require flying through a narrow canyon with minimal maneuvering room, and no options for emergency landing if something went wrong. Elena absorbed every detail of the mission briefing while conducting her portion of the pre-flight inspection with methodical precision. She checked every system and component twice, knowing that mechanical failure during such a dangerous operation could be catastrophic, not just for her crew but for the survivors depending on their rescue efforts. Her technical knowledge, gained through years of maintenance work and intensive study, allowed her to identify potential problems that less experienced pilots might overlook. The flight to the crash site took 40 minutes through increasingly difficult weather conditions. Elena served as co-pilot and navigator, monitoring instruments and radio communications, while Captain Morrison concentrated on flying through the treacherous mountain terrain. As they approached the accident area, visibility dropped to almost zero and wind turbulence became severe enough to make precise control extremely challenging. Elena's first view of the crash site through brief gaps in the swirling snow was sobering. The passenger bus hung precariously on a steep slope, held in place only by a few sturdy pine trees that had prevented it from tumbling further down the mountainside. Survivors could be seen moving around the wreckage, but several appeared to be seriously injured and unable to move without assistance. The terrain around the crash site offered no safe landing options for a full-size helicopter. The valley floor was too narrow and steep for a conventional landing, while the surrounding ridges were covered with trees and boulders that made approach dangerous. Any rescue operation would require precision hover work in turbulent conditions, with minimal margin for error. Captain Morrison attempted the first rescue approach, trying to position their helicopter close enough to the wreckage to allow rescue personnel to reach the survivors. But the combination of wind turbulence, limited visibility, and dangerous terrain made precise positioning almost impossible. After several attempts, Morrison was forced to abort the approach when sudden wind gusts pushed the helicopter dangerously close to the mountainside. "This is impossible," Morrison said over the intercom, frustration evident in her voice. "The wind patterns are too unpredictable and the terrain doesn't give us any room for error. We're going to have to wait for conditions to improve." Elena had been studying the terrain and weather patterns during Morrison's approach attempts, analyzing the factors that made the rescue so difficult. Her years of observation and technical study had taught her to recognize patterns that others might miss, and she had identified several tactical approaches that might work despite the challenging conditions. "Captain," Elena said carefully, "I think there might be another approach vector that would give us better wind protection and visibility. The terrain features create different air patterns depending on approach angle." Morrison looked at Elena with skepticism, knowing that mountain flying required experience that couldn't be gained through study alone. But she also recognized that Elena's technical knowledge had been consistently outstanding, and desperate situations sometimes required unconventional solutions. "What are you thinking?" Morrison asked, willing to consider any option that might make the rescue possible. Elena described an approach route that would use the natural terrain features to provide wind protection while maintaining sufficient clearance from obstacles. Her plan involved approaching from the opposite direction than conventional tactics would suggest, using updrafts created by the valley walls to maintain stable flight conditions while positioning for rescue operations. Morrison studied Elena's suggested approach, recognizing that it demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mountain aerodynamics and tactical flying principles. The approach was unconventional but theoretically sound, and it might work where traditional methods had failed. However, executing such a complex maneuver would require exceptional flying skills and perfect coordination between pilot and co-pilot. Before Morrison could decide whether to attempt Elena's suggested approach, Their radio crackled with urgent updates from other rescue aircraft. 2 other helicopters had attempted to reach the crash site using conventional approaches, and both had been forced to abort due to dangerous wind conditions and visibility problems. The survivors remained isolated with no successful rescue attempts completed. More critically, radio contact with the crash site indicated that several survivors were in critical condition and might not survive much longer without immediate medical attention. The window for successful rescue was closing rapidly, and conventional approaches had proven ineffective under current conditions. The rescue operation needed either a completely different tactical approach or acceptance that the survivors might not be reachable until weather conditions improved significantly. Elena's suggested approach suddenly became the only viable option for immediate rescue attempts. Morrison made the decision to try Elena's unconventional route, knowing that failure could result in their own helicopter crashing and making the overall situation worse. But leaving the survivors without rescue attempts was equally unacceptable, when lives could be saved through skillful flying and calculated risks. "All right," Morrison said over the intercom. "We'll try your approach. But you'll need to serve as my eyes and navigation during the approach. I'll handle the controls, but I need you to guide me through the terrain features and wind patterns you've identified." Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling over her as Morrison began the approach using her suggested route. 20 lives depended on her analysis being correct and her guidance being precise. She had studied these terrain features extensively, but academic knowledge was about to be tested under life-or-death conditions. The approach began smoothly as Elena guided Morrison through the initial phases of the unconventional route. Her predictions about wind patterns proved accurate, with the helicopter maintaining stable flight conditions despite the turbulent weather. Elena called out terrain features, wind changes, and navigation waypoints while monitoring the aircraft's systems and external conditions. As they descended into the valley using Elena's route, the visibility and wind conditions gradually improved exactly as she had predicted. The natural terrain features provided protection from the worst turbulence, while their approach angle gave them better visibility of both the crash site and potential obstacles. Elena's theoretical knowledge was proving accurate under real-world conditions. Morrison was impressed by the effectiveness of Elena's approach planning, but the most dangerous phase of the rescue was still ahead. Positioning the helicopter close enough to the wreckage for rescue operations would require precision flying in a confined space with minimal room for error. Even with improved conditions, the rescue would test the limits of both aircraft and pilot capabilities. As they approached the final positioning phase, Elena spotted something that changed the entire dynamic of the rescue operation. The wreckage of the bus was shifting position, with the trees that had prevented it from falling further down the mountainside beginning to give way under the weight and stress. Several survivors were still trapped inside the bus, and their time was running out as the wreckage became increasingly unstable. "Captain," Elena called out urgently, "the bus is moving. We need to get those people out immediately, or they're going to fall with the wreckage." Morrison could see the same instability Elena had identified, but positioning their helicopter for immediate extraction would require flying closer to the mountainside than any safety protocol would recommend. The rescue would have to be completed quickly before the wreckage shifted enough to send the bus and its remaining occupants tumbling further down the ravine. Elena made a decision that would define the rest of her career. As Morrison struggled to maintain position in the turbulent conditions, while rescue personnel prepared to extract survivors from the unstable wreckage, Elena realized that her co-pilot position gave her better visibility of the critical factors affecting the rescue operation. "Captain, I can see the wind patterns and wreckage stability better from my position. Let me take control for the extraction phase. I can position us more precisely than you can from the pilot's seat." Morrison hesitated, knowing that allowing a cadet to take primary control during such a dangerous operation violated every protocol and regulation she could think of. But she also recognized that Elena's visibility and technical knowledge might be exactly what was needed to complete the rescue successfully. Before Morrison could respond, the situation became even more critical. The radio crackled with reports that the bus wreckage had shifted again, and rescue personnel on the ground estimated they had less than 10 minutes before the remaining trees gave way completely. Several survivors were trapped in parts of the bus that would be unreachable if the wreckage fell further down the mountainside. Elena didn't wait for permission. She smoothly took control of the helicopter, using her detailed knowledge of the terrain and wind patterns to position the aircraft with precision that amazed Morrison. Elena's flying was not just technically competent, but demonstrated an intuitive understanding of helicopter aerodynamics that typically took years to develop. Under Elena's control, the helicopter maintained stable position despite challenging wind conditions, allowing rescue personnel to reach survivors who had been previously inaccessible. Elena adjusted their position continuously, compensating for wind gusts and wreckage movement while maintaining the precise positioning needed for safe personnel extraction. The rescue operation proceeded with remarkable efficiency under Elena's flying. One by one, injured survivors were extracted from the unstable wreckage and transported to the helicopter for medical evacuation. Elena's precise aircraft control allowed rescue personnel to work safely despite the dangerous conditions, and her tactical awareness prevented several potential accidents that could have made the situation worse. As the final survivors were being extracted from the bus, Elena spotted a new problem that threatened to turn successful rescue into tragedy. A small avalanche, triggered by helicopter rotor wash and the stress of the rescue operation, was beginning to develop on the slope above the crash site. If the avalanche gained momentum, it would sweep away both the remaining wreckage and the rescue personnel still working on the mountainside. Elena had seconds to decide between saving the rescue personnel and completing the extraction of the final survivors trapped in the bus. Conventional procedure would be to abort the operation and ensure the safety of the rescue team, even if it meant leaving some survivors behind. But Elena's analysis of the avalanche development suggested there might be just enough time to complete the rescue if everything went perfectly. Elena made the choice that would define her legacy. Instead of aborting the rescue, she used her precise aircraft control to create rotor wash patterns that redirected the developing avalanche away from the rescue site, while simultaneously positioning for extraction of the final survivors. Her flying was so precise and technically sophisticated that she managed to complete the rescue while actually improving safety conditions for everyone involved. The final survivor was extracted from the bus wreckage, just as Elena's predicted avalanche timeline reached its critical point. She immediately repositioned the helicopter to allow rescue personnel to reach safety, then executed a complex departure through deteriorating weather conditions while carrying the full load of injured survivors who required immediate medical attention. Elena's flying during the departure phase was as impressive as her work during the rescue itself. She navigated through worsening weather and difficult terrain while maintaining stable flight conditions for the injured passengers. Her route planning minimized flight time while avoiding the most dangerous weather patterns, ensuring that critical patients received medical attention as quickly as possible. When Elena's helicopter landed at the regional medical center with all 20 survivors from the bus crash, word of her extraordinary rescue operation began spreading immediately through military aviation networks. She had accomplished what experienced mountain rescue pilots had considered impossible under the existing conditions, saving lives that would have been lost with conventional rescue approaches. The rescue operation's success was documented through multiple sources, including radio recordings, witness statements from rescue personnel, and flight data from the helicopter's monitoring systems. Elena's flying had been not just successful, but demonstrated technical skills and tactical judgment that exceeded the capabilities of many senior pilots with decades of experience. Captain Morrison's initial report on the rescue operation praised Elena's performance in terms that she had never used to describe any cadet's abilities. Elena had demonstrated exceptional flying skills, outstanding technical knowledge, superior decision-making under pressure, and the kind of tactical innovation that characterized truly exceptional pilots. Her actions had directly saved 20 lives and prevented what could have been a tragic failure of the rescue operation. But Elena's triumph also created an enormous problem for Commandant Steele and the Academy's leadership. A cadet who had been placed on academic probation and counseled out of the program had just demonstrated flying abilities that surpassed those of senior instructors and experienced combat veterans. Elena's success called into question every evaluation, every counseling session, and every decision that had been made regarding her suitability for the program. The story of Elena's rescue operation spread far beyond Blackwater Academy, reaching military aviation commands throughout the Department of Defense and attracting attention from senior officers who specialized in identifying exceptional talent. Elena's tactical innovations during the rescue were being analyzed by flight training experts, while her technical knowledge and flying abilities were being compared to the very best pilots in military service. Within 72 hours of the rescue operation, Elena received a personal call from General Patricia Hayes, the same officer who had been investigating discriminatory practices at military flight training facilities. General Hayes had been monitoring Elena's situation as part of her broader review of training standards and institutional fairness, and the rescue operation had provided undeniable evidence of Elena's exceptional capabilities. Cadet Vasquez, General Hayes said during their phone conversation, "Your performance during the rescue operation has been remarkable by any standard. More importantly, it has raised serious questions about the evaluation and counseling processes that led to your probationary status. I'm ordering a comprehensive review of your entire training record and the decisions that have been made regarding your future." Elena felt a mixture of relief and vindication as General Hayes explained the scope of the investigation that would examine every aspect of her treatment at Blackwater Academy. The rescue operation had provided objective evidence of her capabilities. That couldn't be dismissed or minimized, and senior military leadership was finally taking notice of the institutional problems that had nearly ended her career before it began. The investigation that followed Elena's rescue operation revealed a pattern of discriminatory treatment that shocked even experienced military investigators. Documentation showed systematic bias in equipment assignments, evaluation procedures, and advancement recommendations that had affected not just Elena, but several other cadets from non-traditional backgrounds. The evidence was so clear and comprehensive that it forced immediate changes in Academy leadership and training procedures. Commandant Steele was relieved of command within a week of the investigation's preliminary findings. His replacement, Colonel Sarah Martinez, was a former combat pilot with a reputation for identifying and developing exceptional talent regardless of background or circumstances. Martinez's first official act was reviewing the cases of all cadets who had been counseled out of the program during Steele's tenure, with particular attention to those whose performance records showed discrepancies between ability and advancement. Elena's probationary status was immediately removed, and she was advanced to the weapons training phase that had been denied following her manipulated evaluation. More significantly, her rescue operation had demonstrated tactical and technical abilities that qualified her for accelerated advancement to the Academy's most elite programs, including special operations and test pilot tracks that were typically reserved for officers with years of combat experience. The transformation in Elena's treatment at the Academy was dramatic and immediate. Fellow cadets who had previously ignored or dismissed her now sought her advice on technical subjects and tactical procedures. Instructors who had been skeptical about her abilities now requested her participation in advanced training exercises and special projects. Elena had gone from institutional problem to institutional asset overnight. But Elena's greatest satisfaction came from the broader changes her case had prompted throughout military aviation training. The investigation into discriminatory practices at Blackwater had revealed similar problems at other facilities, leading to comprehensive reforms in evaluation procedures, instructor training, and advancement criteria. Elena's success had opened doors not just for herself but for future generations of pilots who might face similar institutional barriers. 6 months after the rescue operation, Elena graduated at the top of her class at Blackwater Academy, earning recognition not just for her flying abilities but for her technical innovations and leadership potential. The rescue techniques she had developed during the bus crash operation had been incorporated into standard mountain rescue procedures, and her tactical approaches were being taught to experienced pilots throughout the military aviation system. Elena's first assignment as a qualified military pilot was to the elite Mountain Rescue Squadron based in Colorado, where she would specialize in the kind of high-risk operations that had made her famous. Her commanding officer was Captain Morrison, who had been promoted and transferred specifically to work with Elena in developing new rescue techniques and training procedures. The rescue operation that had saved 20 lives had also launched Elena's career as one of the military's most innovative and capable pilots. Her story became a case study in recognizing and developing exceptional talent, demonstrating that excellence could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances when given the opportunity to flourish. Elena's father would have been proud to know that his daughter had not only achieved her dream of military aviation, but had redefined what was possible for pilots willing to challenge conventional limitations and fight for opportunities to serve. The promise she had made at his grave had been kept in ways that exceeded even her most ambitious hopes, and her legacy would inspire others to pursue their own dreams, regardless of the obstacles they faced. The mountains of Colorado, which had nearly claimed 20 lives in a bus crash, had instead become the stage for Elena's transformation from dismissed cadet to celebrated hero. Her story proved that when institutional barriers finally fell, extraordinary achievement could emerge from the most unexpected sources, changing not just individual lives, but entire systems that had previously limited human potential. Elena Vasquez had started as an invisible janitor and had become a pilot whose innovations would save lives for generations to come. Her journey from the Academy's cleaning closets to its highest honors demonstrated that excellence truly had no prerequisites except dedication, competence, and the courage to never surrender when others had written you off. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.